David pulled his truck over in the pouring rain when he spotted the figure huddled by the roadside. 2 in the morning, the industrial district empty except for water hitting asphalt and dim streetlights cutting through darkness. The young woman sat with arms wrapped around her knees, soaked hair clinging to her face, wearing simple clothes that didn't match the expensive watch on her wrist. "Never leave anyone alone in the rain," his wife's voice echoed from memory. David sighed, turning off the engine. "You okay, miss?" The woman looked up, red-rimmed eyes meeting his with strange disbelief. Her lips moved silently. "David?" A chill ran down his spine. He'd never seen this woman before. How could she know his name? "Do we know each other?" She shook her head, but when David extended his hand, she whispered, "Finally? I found you." Something stirred deep in his chest. The woman's name was Lily, or so she claimed when she sobered up in his truck's passenger seat. David drove through the empty streets of Millbrook, a town where everyone knew everyone, yet this woman remained a complete mystery. She gave vague answers about where she lived, claimed she'd been walking and got caught in the storm. Her hands shook as she clutched a small purse, and David noticed the way she kept glancing at him when she thought he wasn't looking, as if studying his profile in the dashboard light. "I can drop you at the hospital," David offered, but Lily quickly declined. "Just somewhere warm, please." Her voice carried an exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness. David thought of his 8-year-old daughter Emma sleeping at home, probably sprawled across her bed with crayons scattered around her latest drawings. He thought of his tiny garage apartment above Murphy's auto shop, where he'd been living since losing his engineering job 3 years ago. It wasn't much, but it was dry and safe. "There's a diner on 5th Street, he said finally. "They're open all night." Lily nodded, settling back into the worn seat with obvious relief. As they drove, David found himself stealing glances at this mysterious woman who somehow knew his name. The expensive watch, the way she carried herself despite her disheveled state, the careful way she spoke, nothing added up in his mind. But something about her reminded him of the feeling he'd had years ago, when he'd stopped to help at car accidents, when he'd felt useful and needed. Back when he'd believed his engineering skills could make a difference in the world, before layoffs and medical bills had stripped that confidence away. Now he was just a mechanic trying to make ends meet and raise his daughter alone. At the diner, Lily ordered black coffee and sat across from him in the red vinyl booth, her hands wrapped around the warm mug like it was a lifeline. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't have to stop for a stranger like me." David shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude from someone he didn't even know. Anyone would have done the same thing. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true at all. Most people would have driven past, especially at that hour, in that neighborhood where trouble seemed to lurk around every corner. Lily seemed to read his thoughts, a small smile crossing her lips for the first time since he'd found her. "No, not anyone would have stopped. You're different." She reached into her purse and pulled out a $20 bill, far too much for 2 cups of coffee. "For your kindness, and for believing that people still matter." David pushed the money back across the table toward her. "Keep it. Get yourself a cab home when you're ready." Lily's expression changed, something vulnerable and lost flickering across her features like a shadow. "Home," she repeated softly, as if the word felt foreign on her tongue. She looked out the rain-streaked window at the empty street beyond, watching the occasional car pass by. "I've been looking for something for a long time now. Maybe I'm not sure where home is anymore, or if I even deserve to find it." There was a story there, David realized, layers of meaning and pain he couldn't begin to understand or unravel, but he recognized the look in her eyes, the same lost expression he'd seen in his own mirror during those dark months after Rebecca's death, when the world felt empty and colorless. When he finally dropped Lily at a modest hotel downtown, she hesitated before getting out of the truck, her hand on the door handle. "David," she said, and hearing his name from her lips still sent that strange recognition through him. "Would it be weird if I said I hoped I'd see you again sometime?" He found himself nodding, though he couldn't explain why. "Murphy's auto shop on Elm Street. I work there most days if you're ever in the neighborhood." She smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her all night, and something in his chest loosened for the first time in years. 3 days later, Lily appeared at Murphy's garage carrying a thermos of coffee and a bag of pastries from the expensive bakery across town. "I thought you might be hungry," she said simply, as if bringing lunch to near strangers was perfectly normal behavior. David wiped his grease-stained hands on his coveralls, suddenly aware of how he must look. Unshaven, tired, nothing like the confident engineer he'd once been. But Lily didn't seem to notice or care about his appearance. She sat on an overturned crate and watched him work with genuine interest, asking questions about engines and transmissions, with curiosity that seemed real rather than polite. "You know a lot about cars for someone who—" David paused, realizing he had no idea what Lily did for work or how she spent her days. She'd been deliberately vague about her life, deflecting personal questions with the skill of someone accustomed to privacy. "For someone who walks everywhere," he finished diplomatically, not wanting to pry into her business. Lily laughed, a sound that completely transformed her entire face and made her look years younger. "I'm good at picking things up quickly, I suppose." She gestured to the garage walls, where David had taped up old engineering blueprints and sketches of engine modifications he'd designed years ago during his corporate days. "These are yours?" Her voice held a note of surprise, almost awe, as she studied the detailed drawing. David felt heat rise in his cheeks, embarrassed by the reminder of his former ambitions. Old hobby stuff, nothing important or useful anymore. But Lily stood and moved closer to examine the detailed drawings, her finger tracing the precise lines and calculations with obvious understanding. "These aren't hobby sketches," she said quietly, her voice filled with certainty. "These are professional-grade designs, advanced ones that show real engineering talent." The way she said it with such confidence and knowledge made David look at her more carefully. How would someone who worked odd jobs recognize complex engineering schematics? Lily seemed to catch herself, quickly adding, "I mean, they look complicated and important to someone like me." Over the following weeks, Lily became a regular fixture at the garage, as much a part of the daily routine as morning coffee. She'd arrive in the afternoon, sometimes bringing food, sometimes just sitting quietly while David worked on various repairs. Emma had started joining them after school, initially shy around the strange woman who'd appeared in their lives like a guardian angel. But Lily had a natural way with children, listening to Emma's endless chatter about her day, admiring her drawings with genuine enthusiasm, never talking down to her the way many adults did. "Your dad fixes more than just cars," Lily told Emma one afternoon, nodding toward David's engineering sketches pinned to the wall. "He solves problems and makes things better for people." Emma beamed with pride, and David felt something shift in his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced in months. It had been so long since anyone had seen value in his dreams, in the part of himself he'd buried under the weight of survival and responsibility. Lily watched him with those observant eyes, and he began to feel like maybe he wasn't just the small-town mechanic he'd convinced himself he'd become. Maybe there was still something worth salvaging in the man he used to be, something worth fighting for. But late at night, alone in his small apartment above the garage, David found himself wondering who Lily really was beneath the surface, and why someone with her obvious intelligence and resources was spending time in his run-down garage. The first crack in Lily's carefully constructed persona came on a Wednesday afternoon, when her phone rang during one of Emma's animated stories about her art teacher. Lily glanced at the screen and her face went pale, fear flickering in her eyes. "I need to take this call," she said, stepping outside into the afternoon sunshine. Through the garage's open bay door, David could hear fragments of conversation that didn't match the woman he'd come to know and care about. "The quarterly projections are behind schedule. The board meeting has been moved to Friday. We need to finalize the acquisition timeline before the end of the month." Her voice carried an authority, a crispness that belonged in corporate boardrooms, not small-town garages. When she returned, Lily's smile seemed forced and brittle, like glass ready to shatter. "Sorry about that, wrong number," she said, but David had heard enough to know it wasn't true. Emma, with the brutal directness that only children possess, asked, "Miss Lily, do you have an important job somewhere else?" Lily's laugh sounded strained and artificial, nothing like her usual genuine warmth. "Not really, sweetheart. I just help people sometimes when they need it." But David caught the way her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee, the way she avoided his eyes and seemed to retreat into herself. Whatever Lily was hiding, it was eating at her from the inside, creating cracks in the facade she worked so hard to maintain. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, David found himself staring at his wife's old jewelry box on the dresser, a habit he'd developed during the loneliest nights. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper like a precious secret, was Rebecca's watch. A simple silver piece she'd worn every day until the cancer treatments made her too weak to care about time anymore. "Give this to someone special," she'd whispered during those final weeks, her voice barely audible. "Someone who understands that time is precious and shouldn't be wasted." David had never been able to bring himself to even touch it since her death. But tonight, thinking about Lily's mysterious phone calls and the sadness she tried so hard to hide, he wondered if his wife had somehow known that someone special would eventually find their way into his life. The confrontation came on a rainy Thursday, almost exactly a month after their first meeting in the storm. David was alone in the garage, working on a stubborn transmission, when a black sedan pulled up outside, the kind of expensive car that cost more than he made in 2 years. A woman in a perfectly tailored suit stepped out, looking completely out of place in the oil-stained garage bay, like a corporate executive who'd taken a wrong turn. "I'm looking for Lily Anderson," she said, her voice crisp and professional, cutting through the air like a blade. "Her assistant mentioned she might be here visiting you." David's world tilted on its axis. Lily Anderson. He'd heard that name before, seen it in business magazines at the diner, read about the young tech CEO who'd inherited her family's company and turned it into a billion-dollar empire. "There's no one here by that name," he said carefully, but the woman's knowing smile told him his face had already given him away completely. "Mr. Torres, I presume? Lily's mentioned you in her reports to the board. I'm Janet Walsh, her head of security. Miss Anderson has been missing from her scheduled meetings for weeks now. Her family and investors are deeply concerned about her whereabouts." When Lily arrived an hour later with her usual coffee and bright smile, David was waiting in the garage bay. His world forever changed. The sedan was gone. He'd asked Janet to leave, needing to hear the truth from Lily herself before making any decisions, but the moment she saw his expression, her careful mask began to crumble like old plaster. "You know," she said simply, not a question but a statement of resignation. David nodded, holding up the business card Janet had left behind like evidence of a crime. Lily Anderson, Chief Executive Officer, Anderson Technologies. "Why?" was all he managed to say, the single word carrying the weight of his confusion and hurt. Lily set down the coffee with shaking hands and sank onto the crate that had become her usual spot, suddenly looking fragile and vulnerable. "5 years ago, I was in a terrible car accident on Highway 27. Head-on collision with a drunk driver. My car flipped 3 times and caught fire. I was bleeding out on the side of the road, trapped and dying, and this man appeared from nowhere like an angel. He pulled me from the wreckage, used his shirt to stop the bleeding, held pressure on the wound until the paramedics arrived. I was conscious just long enough to hear him give his name to the EMTs, David Torres. Then I passed out from blood loss, and when I woke up in the hospital 3 days later, he was gone." David's legs felt weak, and he had to lean against his workbench for support. Highway 27, 5 years ago. He remembered that night with crystal clarity, driving home from a job interview that had gone nowhere, seeing the twisted metal and flames, and knowing someone needed help desperately. He'd acted on pure instinct, doing what needed to be done, leaving before the questions started because he'd been driving on a suspended license and couldn't afford to get involved with police reports or legal complications. "You could have died that night," he said quietly, the memory flooding back in vivid detail. "I should have died," Lily corrected, her voice barely above a whisper, tears beginning to flow. "You saved me, David, and then you disappeared like some kind of guardian angel, like you were never there at all. I spent years trying to find you, hiring private investigators, following every lead, checking every David Torres in 3 states. It's a common name, and you'd moved twice since then, changed jobs, seemed to vanish into thin air. I was starting to think I'd imagined you, that maybe I'd dreamed the whole thing during my coma. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. Until that night in the rain, when I was having the worst day of my life, feeling completely lost and alone, and there you were again. Same kind eyes, same gentle voice, same willingness to help a stranger. I knew it was you the moment you spoke my name. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity, like a puzzle he'd never wanted to solve. The expensive watch, the careful questions about his engineering background, the way she'd studied his face that first night like she was memorizing every detail. This whole thing has been a lie, David said, anger rising in his chest like bile. The coffee, the conversations, getting close to Emma. It's all been some kind of elaborate thank you note from a guilty rich girl trying to ease her conscience. Lily flinched as if he'd physically slapped her across the face. No, that's not, she started desperately, but David was already turning away, unable to look at her anymore. I get it now, he said bitterly, his voice filled with hurt and humiliation. Poor mechanic saves rich CEO's life. She feels obligated to throw him some charity, make him feel special for a while, before returning to her real world. He gestured around the garage, at his modest life, his simple world that suddenly felt pathetic and small. Well, congratulations, mission accomplished. You can go back to your board meetings and quarterly projections now with a clear conscience. Lily stood, reaching for him desperately, but David stepped back as if her touch would burn him. Don't do this. Emma's already attached to you, and this is going to break her heart into pieces. The pain in Lily's eyes almost made him reconsider, but the humiliation burned too deep, like acid in his veins. He'd allowed himself to hope, to imagine that someone like her could actually care about someone like him. What a fool he'd been to believe in fairy tales. Lily left without another word, but she returned the next morning with a small package wrapped in brown paper. David found it on his workbench when he arrived at the garage. A wooden box containing Rebecca's watch, somehow repaired and gleaming like new, with a note written in careful handwriting. This was broken, but all the pieces were still there. It just needed someone who understood its true value to make it whole again. Like me. Like you. I'm sorry I lied about who I was, but I've never been more honest about anything than how I feel about you and Emma. The man who saved my life 5 years ago gave me more than just additional years to live. He gave me hope that truly good people still exist in this world. I'll respect your decision and stay away, but please know that meeting you again wasn't about obligation or guilt. It was the answer to 5 years of prayers and searching. David held the watch in his trembling hands, its steady ticking filling the silent garage like a heartbeat. Rebecca's inscription on the back caught the morning light. Time heals, love remains. He thought about the past month, about Lily's genuine laughter when Emma told her terrible jokes, the way she'd listened to his stories about Rebecca without jealousy or judgment, how she'd made him feel like his dreams and designs still mattered to someone in this world. Had that all been an elaborate performance? Or had a woman who could have anything she wanted chosen to spend her precious free time in a rundown garage because she'd found something here worth more than money? That evening, Emma asked where Miss Lily had gone, her young face filled with confusion and loss. She had to go back to her real life, sweetheart, David said carefully, but Emma's 8-year-old wisdom cut straight through his careful deflection like a knife. Daddy, if you like someone and they like you back, isn't that already real enough? Her innocent question haunted him through a sleepless night, as did the memory of Lily's tears, the genuine pain in her voice when she'd tried to explain her deception. Maybe he'd been so afraid of being someone's charity case, so terrified of being pitied, that he'd missed the possibility of being someone's genuine choice. Maybe his pride had cost him the first real happiness he'd felt since Rebecca's death. 2 weeks later, David was working late in the garage when he heard Emma's terrified scream from their apartment upstairs. He raced up the narrow staircase to find her standing in the kitchen, her small arm tangled in the coffee maker's electrical cord, hot water pooling on the floor, and her hand already blistering red from the burn. "It's okay, baby, it's okay," he said, his own hand shaking as he ran cold water over her injury, but the burn looked serious enough to require immediate professional medical attention. The emergency room was 20 minutes away, through winding country roads, and his truck was in the shop with a blown transmission that he couldn't afford to fix. He was reaching for his phone to call an expensive ambulance when headlights suddenly flooded the driveway like salvation. Lily's car. Not the intimidating sedan from that awful confrontation, but the modest Honda she'd been driving to the garage every day. She was out of the car and rushing toward them before he could even process her presence. Taking one look at Emma's tears and the burn on her small hand, and immediately understanding the situation. "Hospital now," she said simply, and within minutes they were racing through the empty streets, Lily driving with steady precision, while David held his injured daughter in the back seat, whispering comfort into her hair. At the emergency room, Lily took charge with quiet efficiency, speaking to nurses and doctors in the same authoritative voice David had overheard during that mysterious phone call weeks ago. But when the medical staff tried to send them to a private room with special accommodations, she shook her head firmly. "We'll wait our turn like everyone else," she said with conviction. She sat with them in the crowded waiting room for 4 long hours, entertaining Emma with stories and silly games, never once checking her phone or showing any sign of impatience or regret. This wasn't the behavior of someone fulfilling a guilty obligation. This was love in action, pure and simple. When the doctor finally confirmed that Emma's burn would heal without permanent damage or scarring, Lily's relief was so obvious and overwhelming that David felt his carefully constructed walls begin to crumble like ancient stone. "Thank you," he said as they walked to the parking lot in the early morning light, dawn breaking over the mountains. "You didn't have to come. You didn't have to help us." Lily stopped walking and turned to face him, her expression more vulnerable and open than he'd ever seen it before. "David, when are you going to understand something important? I never do anything I don't want to do. I have more money than I know what to do with, more obligations than I can count, people demanding my attention every minute of every day. But the only place I've ever felt truly at peace, truly myself, is in your garage, listening to Emma's stories and watching you bring broken things back to life with your hands." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper, one of Emma's drawings from weeks ago. A crayon picture of 3 stick figures, standing outside a building, labeled Daddy's Garage. In uneven letters, "Emma drew this the day we first met. She told me it was her family portrait. I asked who the third person was and she said, 'That's Miss Lily. She belongs with us now.'" Lily's voice broke slightly, emotion overwhelming her careful composure. "An 8-year-old girl saw what I was too scared and prideful to say out loud. I didn't find you by accident in that rain, David. I had been searching for you for 5 long years. But I didn't plan what happened after that first night, and I certainly didn't expect it. I fell in love with your kindness, your incredible talent, the way you see the best in everything around you, even old engines and broken drawings. I fell in love with the man who saves people without expecting anything in return, who raises his daughter with such love and patience." David stood in the hospital parking lot, dawn breaking over the distant mountains in brilliant colors, holding his sleeping daughter while the woman who'd turned his world upside down waited for his answer with hope and fear in her eyes. The watch in his pocket, Rebecca's watch that Lily had somehow made whole again, ticked steadily against his chest like a second heartbeat. Time heals, love remains. Maybe it was finally time to let himself heal, to let love remain and grow. "Emma was right," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion and unshed tears. "You do belong with us." 6 months later, the garage had been expanded and completely modernized, with new equipment that allowed David to pursue the custom engine designs he'd abandoned years ago during his darkest period. Lily had provided the financial investment, but she'd been extremely careful to structure it as a genuine business partnership, not charity or pity. "You're not my project or my guilt," she'd insisted during one of their late-night planning sessions over coffee and blueprints. "You're my partner in business and in life, if you'll have me in both roles." The engineering firm that had laid David off 3 years earlier had offered him his old position back at twice his previous salary after seeing his latest innovations. But he'd turned them down without hesitation. He had everything he needed and wanted right here in Millbrook. On a quiet Sunday morning, David found Lily and Emma in the garage, working together on a large painting of the shop's new sign. Emma had insisted on adding colorful flowers around the border, to make it pretty for Miss Lily, and Lily had patiently helped her mix the perfect shade of yellow for the cheerful sunflowers. Watching them together, their heads bent over the canvas in serious concentration, David felt the kind of deep contentment he'd thought was lost forever after Rebecca's death. "Daddy," Emma said without looking up from her careful brushstrokes, "Miss Lily says she's going to stay with us forever and ever. Is that really okay with you?" David met Lily's eyes over Emma's head, seeing the question there, the hope she was still afraid to voice completely after everything they'd been through. "Forever and ever sounds exactly right to me," he said, and Emma's delighted squeal of joy echoed through the entire garage. Lily smiled, that genuine smile that had first made his chest loosen and his heart hope months ago, and reached for his hand across the paint supplies. Her fingers intertwined with his, stained with yellow paint and warm with life, as Emma chattered excitedly about their plans for the flower garden they were going to plant behind the shop next spring. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, David and Lily sat together on the front porch of the small house they'd bought together, close enough to the garage for David to walk to work, big enough for Emma to have her own art studio, simple and perfect enough to feel like home. Lily wore Rebecca's watch now, a gift David had given her on the day she'd officially moved in with them. "Rebecca would have liked you very much," he said, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky above them. "She always used to say that the best people in the world were the ones who chose love over fear, even when love seemed scary and uncertain." Lily leaned against his shoulder, solid and warm and completely real in his arms. "I spent 5 years looking for the man who saved my life," she said quietly into the peaceful evening air. "I never expected to find the man who would teach me how to truly live it with purpose and joy." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the familiar sounds of their small town settling into night. Crickets singing in the grass, distant music from the diner down the street, the occasional car passing by on its way home to family. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new engines to fix, new dreams to build, together with their own hands. But tonight, in the precious space between what was and what could be, David understood something profound that his wife had tried to tell him years ago. Love doesn't always arrive when we expect it, but it always arrives exactly when we need it most in our lives. Sometimes the thing you give away doesn't come back to you as an object, but as a person who chooses to stay beside you through all of life's storms. Sometimes saving someone else is really just another way of saving yourself from loneliness and despair. And sometimes, in the space between a stranger's cry for help and your decision to stop and care, the entire trajectory of 2 lives can shift towards something beautiful and unexpected. A reminder that kindness, like love, has a way of finding its way home to where it belongs.